Welcome to This Explainer. Why is it that a man who died over 2 millennia ago still perfectly defines our modern idea of boundless ambition? Well, today we're diving headfirst into the life, the grueling campaigns, and the massive, enduring legacy of history's absolute most relentless conqueror, Alexander the Great. We're going to track his journey all the way from a young Macedonian prince to a man who literally reshaped the ancient world. And to really kick things off, let's look at an unbelievable statistic that completely sets the stage for the sheer scale of his ambition.
5,200,000 square kilometers. That is the vast expanse of the known world that Alexander conquered. And here's the real kicker. He did all of this while battling across incredibly diverse terrain, fighting against vastly different enemies, and he never lost a single battle. Not one. And he achieved this entire, totally unprecedented military record all before dying at the incredibly young age of just 32. It's almost impossible to even comprehend that level of momentum, right?
So, let's look at where it began. Part 1. Forged for Greatness. The Making of a Conqueror.
How exactly does a person generate that kind of unstoppable momentum? Well, it really starts with his early years, where he was intensely groomed for power in the Kingdom of Macedon. You see, Alexander wasn't just handed a sword and told to fight, he was given a world-class education. He was personally tutored by the legendary philosopher Aristotle, who completely saturated his mind with high ideals, philosophy, and medicine. In fact, Alexander was so inspired by the epic heroes of the past that he famously kept an annotated copy of Homer's Iliad right under his pillow. But his biggest influence, and honestly, his biggest rival, was his own father, King Philip II. Philip had already transformed Macedonia into an absolute powerhouse, and Alexander was driven by this deep, almost reckless need to outdo his father's massive achievements. He was genuinely worried his dad would leave no great conquest for him to display to the world.
And the story behind this famous quote from his father is just incredible. Philip actually said this to Alexander when the boy was only 10 years old. A trader had brought this fearsome wild horse named Bucephalus to the king, and nobody could tame it. But young Alexander noticed something that literally everyone else missed. The horse was simply terrified of its own shadow. So just by turning the horse toward the sun, Alexander easily mounted and tamed him. Philip was so moved by this crazy display of courage and sharp observation that he wept, bought the horse on the spot, and realized right then and there that Macedonia could never, ever contain his son.
Moving right along to Part 2, Crushing the Persian Empire, a lightning campaign.
That fierce childhood ambition was completely unleashed in 336 BC. After his father's assassination, a 20-year-old Alexander took the throne, secured his borders, and immediately aimed his sights on the ultimate prize, crushing the massive Persian Empire. And the sheer velocity of his march was just staggering. In 334 BC, he crosses into Asia and wins at Granicus. Literally a year later, he defeats the Persian king Darius III at Issus. The following year, he conducts these grueling, utterly brutal sieges at Tyre and Gaza, then marches straight into Egypt. Finally, in 331 BC, he strikes the ultimate blow at the Battle of Gaugamela. In just a handful of years, he completely steamrolled the reigning superpower of the ancient world.
The absolutely crucial point here is his military genius. Against the mighty Achaemenid Empire, Alexander remained entirely undefeated. Even when he was vastly outnumbered, he perfectly utilized the Macedonian phalanx. These are troops armed with massive 20-foot pikes called sarissas, and combined them with rapid, incredibly decisive cavalry charges that he very often led himself. This tactical brilliance allowed him to shatter the Persian lines time and time again, ultimately toppling King Darius III and claiming the title of King of Asia.
Part 3. To the Ends of Earth. Pushing the Limits.
For most people, conquering the largest empire on Earth would be plenty, but not for Alexander. His boundless ambition pushed him further eastward, aiming to literally reach the ends of the known world. So let's jump to 326 BC. He pushes into the Indian subcontinent and faces what is easily his toughest military challenge yet at the Battle of the Hydaspes. He goes up against King Porus and a terrifying corps of Indian war elephants. I mean, imagine being a foot soldier facing that, an entirely unfamiliar, horrifying obstacle. Yet, true to form, Alexander adapts his tactics, opening his ranks to actually envelop the elephants, and secures yet another epic victory.
But even the most fine-tuned machine eventually runs out of steam. By the time the army reaches the Hydaspes River, his men have been marching and fighting for years. They are completely exhausted, their armor is basically falling apart, and they start hearing terrifying rumors of the massive Nunda Empire up ahead, supposedly waiting with hundreds of thousands of soldiers and thousands more of those war elephants. Finally, the unbreakable Macedonian army breaks. They mutiny. They flat out refuse to take another step east, desperately longing for their homeland. An enraged and bitterly disappointed Alexander realizes he has absolutely no choice. He's forced to turn back.
Which brings us to Part 4, The Fall of a God, Paranoia and Fractures.
As we pivot to the latter half of his campaign, the story takes a significantly darker turn. The very same ambition and sense of grand destiny that made him great began to severely alienate him from his closest troops. Traditionally, Macedonian kings were seen as first among equals. They fought right alongside their men in a very traditional military brotherhood. But after conquering Persia and visiting Egypt, where the oracle of Ammon actually pronounced him the son of a deity, Alexander fundamentally changed. He began claiming Zeus Ammon was his true father. He started adopting Persian court customs and even demanded proskynesis, meaning he required his Greek and Macedonian officers to physically prostrate themselves on the ground before him. To the Greeks, that was an act reserved strictly for the gods.
This intense cultural friction, combined with Alexander's rapidly growing paranoia, peaked in a really tragic way. At a banquet in Maracanda, in a violent, completely drunken argument over these very customs, Alexander personally grabbed a spear and murdered Clitus the Black. And this wasn't just any officer. Clitus was a close friend who had literally saved Alexander's life years earlier at the Battle of the Granicus. It was a truly shocking moment that showed just how isolated and volatile the king had become.
And sadly, that volatility followed him right to the very end. Devastated by the death of his dearest companion Hephaestion and weakened by a sudden, still mysterious illness, Alexander died in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar II in Babylon in 323 BC. When he was asked on his deathbed who should inherit this vast, unparalleled empire, he supposedly offered this incredibly chilling final decree: to the strongest. He left absolutely no clear heir, and the man who had spent his entire lifetime exercising absolute control ended up sparking decades of bloody, chaotic civil war among his generals that completely tore his massive empire apart.
Finally, Part 5, A World Forever Changed, the Hellenistic Legacy.
Yet the story definitely doesn't end with the collapse of his political empire. Out of the ashes of that fractured landscape arose a completely transformed cultural world. During his conquests, Alexander founded approximately 70 cities all across his empire, the most famous of these, of course, being Alexandria in Egypt. Originally established as defensive garrisons or strategic outposts, many of these cities very quickly grew into massive, thriving hubs for cultural diffusion, bringing Greek and local peoples together in ways the world had never seen.
This sparked what historians call the Hellenization effect. Greek culture, language, and population spread far and wide throughout the former Persian Empire. Koine Greek actually became the lingua franca of the entire region. Fun fact, it's actually the language the New Testament would eventually be written in, which just proves how vast and enduring his cultural footprint really was. Town planning, education, and art were suddenly modeled on classical ideals. Trade totally exploded between East and West, and entirely new kingdoms, like the Greco-Bactrian and Indo-Greek kingdoms, were formed out of this cross-pollination.
And speaking of cross-pollination, the cultural blending we see here is just mind-blowing. Along the Silk Road, Hellenistic culture hybridized deeply with Buddhist culture, resulting in something called Greco-Buddhism. In fact, some of the very first figurative portrayals of the Buddha in India were directly influenced by the artistic style of Greek statues of the god Apollo. It's a stunning visual testament to just how deeply connected the ancient world became simply because of one man's massive march eastward.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a pivotal question to ponder. How should history truly remember him? Do we look at the incredible cultural legacy, the Hellenistic world, and the syncretism he sparked, and see a visionary who, intentionally or unintentionally, united disparate worlds? Or, when we look at the bloodshed, the murdered friends, and the deeply fractured empire he left behind, do we just see a ruthless force of boundless ambition, a man who was ultimately destroyed by his own legendary myth? It's a fascinating debate that has lasted well over 2 millennia. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the source material, and as always, keep questioning the history in front of you.